Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Yud Aleph of Zevachim. We got a little bit behind over the Rosh Hashanah holiday. We are at Amar Mar on the second wide line of Yud Amabet. We have we just went back to our Mishnah, and in our Mishnah, we had Rebbe Eliezer say that not only do we say that the Chatas and the Pesach on Pesach, or on Erev Pesach to be technical, that the Chatas and the Pesach on Erev Pesach are korbanot, where if you have in mind the wrong korban, not only does it not count for whatever fulfillment, but it's actually a puzzle situation. Not only do we say that by Chatas and a Pesach for Pesach, but rather but we also say it for an asham. So that was Rabbi Eliezer's position in our Mishnah, and it makes a lot of sense because there's a way, because at the end of the day we say kachatas ka'asham, that this is a pasuk in Vayikra that notes the fact that that essentially juxtaposes the two things together. This is a pasuk Vayikra Perek Zion, Pasuk Zion. And so as a result, the full Pasuk is Kachatas Kasham Torah Achas Lahem, that they have one law. HaKohen Asher Yichaper Bo Lo Yiyah, that the Kohen gets the sacrifice. He's going to be able to eat whatever meat that's going to get eaten is by the Kohen. But the point is that we say this juxtaposition of the two tells us that, just like, according to Rabbi Eliezer, just like the chatas, if you have in mind the wrong korban, so too it's not going to be valid. So too the asham, if you have in mind the wrong korban, it's not going to be valid. Whereas the Tanakama said no. When it comes to every korban other than the chatas and the Pesach for Pesach, then it's going to be a valid korban. It just won't fulfill your obligation. You'll have to bring a new one. So that's where we're up to. So we then cited a long brisa that had a discussion between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua was advocating for the Tanakama's position in our Mishnah, and of course Rabbi Eliezer was advocating for his own position. So we have now been going through. That's what we did. That brisa was the brisa that was on the bottom of Yud Amud Aleph and the top of Yud Amud Bet. And now we've been going through the brisa to say, well, 1 second, why didn't they make this argument, or why didn't they make that argument? And so now we're up to Amar Mar, again quoting the brisa. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua lo ima Marta. So Rabbi Yoshua said during the argument that we quoted in the brisa, to go back to where it was, he said the following. He said, where is it? Near the very beginning of the brisa on Yud Amud Aleph, Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, lo ima marta b'chatas shekain dam alamala. How can you learn from a chatas offering to an asham? The chatas offering throws the blood above the red line, whereas the asham throws the blood below the red line. Again, there's a red line on the altar in the Beis Hamikdash, and most sacrifices have their blood put below the red line, but there are a few that have their blood above the red line, and specifically the chatas. And so the question is, so that's the discussion point that Rabbi Yoshua said. You can't learn from that. So then, as a result, what did Rabbi Eliezer responded back? Yeah, you're right. I can't learn just from that, but I can combine it with the Pesach, which has the blood below the line, and so as a result, it doesn't make a difference that it's below, above the line, or below the line. So that was the discussion that we had yesterday. So the question that the Gemara now asks is, Lemale Rabbi Eliezer, Asham Nami Damam Lamala. Why didn't he just say, hey, the blood of the Asham is also supposed to be above that line? And so as a result, you can't distinguish between the two based on that. So Amar Abaye, Asham Damo Lamala Lo Matzis. No, nobody would say that the Asham can have its blood above. Kal v'chomer mi Ola, because you can make a Kal v'chomer from an Ola. Ma Ola shehi Chalil Damad Lamata, that even though an Ola is completely destroyed, completely consumed on the Mizbeach, and yet its blood goes below the line, Asham she'enu Khalil lo kol shekain. Well, then an Asham who is not completely consumed certainly should have its blood spilled below the line, or put on the Mizbeach below the line. So Mala Ola shekain Eina Mechaperes Chatasa Ovtochel. Well, 1 second, how can you prove, how does that work? After all, the Ola doesn't do any kapara. So as a result, that shouldn't be a sufficient source of a counter proof, because an Ola, does not, but an Asham does do bring kapara. So maybe because an Asham brings kapara, it's going to be different from an Ola, and therefore, even though an Ola's blood is below the line, maybe an Asham's blood really is above the line. So Chatasa Ov Tochiach. Now we can say that the bird sin offering, this is a couple situations where you have a bird sin offering, but the easiest one is the Ola Korban Ola V'Yored, where you have the middle level involves birds, and so as a result, birds are a sin offering that has its blood below the line. So as a result, that shows, if you combine Ola with the bird chatas, so then it shows that below the line, the fact that it atones for some sin doesn't matter. That it doesn't mean that it's going to be above the line, because the bird is below the line. But malachatas ha'of shekain eina min zevach. But you can't bring a proof against an asham. An asham is a large animal, whereas the birds are small, are very small animals, and so as a result, you can't bring a proof that from a bird to another kind of sacrifice. So ola tochiach, yeah, but 1 second, the ola shows that a large sacrifice also ends up being below the line. So lo ra'ei zekareza, lo ra'ei zekareza. So we're going to learn from a combination of the bird chatas and the ola that hatzara shava shebehen kodshe kodshim. They're both holy of holies, meaning that they're the holiest type of sacrifice, which means that they're not consumed by regular people. They're only consumed, if at all, by kohanim. Daman lamata, and yet their blood is below. Afani avi asham. So too the asham, shehu kodesh kodeshim. It's one of the holy sacrifices. V'daman lamata. Its blood also should go below the line. So doesn't that show? So now we've shown that even Rabbi Eliezer would agree that an asham's blood is below the line. So Amrle Rava Meparzakya LeRav Ashi. So Velifroch Malat Tzadashava Shebehen. Maybe we could ask on this Tzadashava that when you have what's the common characteristics? Shekain Ein Lahen Kitzva. When it comes to the Ola and the bird Chatas, both of them have no minimum value. The Tomer Ba'asham Sheyesh Lo Kitzva. But when it comes to the asham, it does have a minimum value, and in fact, the minimum value is 2 shkalim. So Ela Hainu Taima de Rabbi Eliezer. So we've eliminated Abaye's answer, and now we try another new answer as to why a Rabbi Eliezer's would not possibly say that an asham would have its blood above the line. Damar Kra HaKohen HaMechate Osa. That the pasuk says that this is a pasuk Vayikra Vav pasuk Yud Tet, that the Kohen who throws it, this is said regarding a chatas, Otadama Lamala. Only that blood is thrown above. The ain damo shel acher lamala, but no other blood is thrown above. Well, 1 second. Ihachi chatas nami nema ota lishma kshera shelo lishma psula. Well, 1 second. If you're going to say that there's a rule that is specific for a chatas, why not say that the rule that's specific for a chatas is that only a chatas, if you have something else in mind, won't be kosher. But if you have, but any other korban, if you have something else in mind, it will be kosher. And so as a result, why don't we say that? Ha shar zvachim, bein lishman, bein shelo lishman, ksherim, which implies that for all other sacrifices, namely including an asham, meaning unlike Rabbi Eliezer, it would be valid for their own sake and not for anything else. So no, you can't say that. Hahu osa lav dafka. That osa is not being too specific. It's not actually excluding every other sacrifice, shayer Pesach, because we know that there's a second sacrifice that isn't kosher if you have in mind the wrong sacrifice when you do it, namely a Pesach on Erev Pesach. So hachanami lavdavka. So as a result, we could say, but once you say that it's lavdavka with respect to the intention of the korban, say it's also lavdavka in connection with the spilling of the blood. Dehashayer olas haof, because actually you have an ola of a bird that when the chatas of the bird, the blood is below the line. Right. But when you have the ola of the bird, the blood is above the line. And so as a result, we now have an exception here as well with respect to the blood. And once we have one exception, maybe we have another exception. So bezvicha mia lo shayar midu. No, because you can't bring a proof from the bird. The bird isn't a large animal the way you have to bring for an asham. So this actually does work because there is no formal exception. Well, ibayazema hamani. Well, 1 second. Who is it that says that says that that the view is that nothing has been left out? Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, he Amar Hai Makom Lechud, Hai Makom Lechud. Or so we can either say, you know what, that in fact, when it comes to the sin offering, it is offered in a different location than the bird ola. The Tanya, because we say damim hatachtonim nitanim michut hasikra ulamata, that when you throw blood below the line, it's got to go below the line. And when it's going to go above, it means it's going above the line. Rabbi Shimon says, though, there's more to it than that. It's not a simple line, and everything that's below is below, and everything that's above is above. There are some things that need to be in particular locations. What is it where we're talking about where all you care about is that red line, ba'olas ha'of, when it comes to the bird of Ola? But when you have a regular sin offering, it needs to go on the horns itself. Now, what are the horns? Each of the four corners of the mizbeach, of the outer altar, had a 1 amma by 1 amma projection up into the air. Okay, and so as a result, those projections were effectively considered like the horns. And so as a result, those projections are where the blood needs to go, according to Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. And so, but the bottom line is that we end up saying that everybody agrees that when it comes to the blood of an asham, it goes below the line, or at least it doesn't go on the same corners where the blood of the chatas goes. And so as a result, that's why Rabbi Eliezer does not respond, hey, yes, but maybe the blood of the asham is just in the same place as the blood of the chatas. Instead, he cites in the brisa, he cites the korban Pesach where the blood is below the line. And so therefore he says, well, look, there's one that's above the line, there's one that's below the line. Clearly the line doesn't matter in terms of whether or not you have in mind the wrong korban, whether it should be puzzle. And so as a result, he says, learn from both. Yeah. He says, because it says kachatas ka'asham, we are going to say that the asham is just like the chatas, and if you have in mind the wrong korban, it's going to be puzzle.
So does
Unlike
it
every
matter where
other
they put the?
carbon.
I'm confused with if they were to they would sprinkle the blood below or above. It doesn't matter for the asham. Is that what he's
No,
saying?
no, 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 no. We're not saying that at all. We're saying the question was Rabbi Yoshua had tried to disprove Rabbi Eliezer's proof by saying the blood of the chatas is above the line. And rather than say, well, the blood of the asham is above the line, we said something else. And so the question is why didn't Rabbi Eliezer respond? Oh, well, the blood of the asham is also above the line. Meaning, if that were true, that would be a great response. And the answer is because it's not true. And we've just spent the last 10, 15 minutes proving that it's not true. Okay, so it's not true. So therefore, that's why Rabbi Eliezer needed to come up with a different argument in the brisa.
So
Okay.
they couldn't have kavanah for the asham, right? If
And
it
so again, Rabbi Eliezer says if you're bringing an asham and you have in mind any other korban, it's not going to be valid. According to the Tanakama and Rabbi Yoshua, if you have in mind another korban for an asham, it is a valid sacrifice. It just won't satisfy your obligations to bring an asham. So it remains kosher. The Kohanim get to eat it. The parts that are supposed to be burned get burned, etc., etc. Okay, so now we are going to see there's a Mishnah that we see all the way down on Daf Pei Aleph Amud Bet that is going to also use this same pasuk of kachatas kasham vayikra zayin zayin. So let's see what that Mishnah says. Sudan Hasam. So we learned over there again, Daf Pei Aleph Amud Bet. Shahaya Rabbi Akiva Omer. Rabbi Akiva would say, Kol damim shenichnesu lahecha lechaper psulim. That if you bring any blood into the Kodesh in order to put it on the golden altar that is the Mizbeach HaZahav that is in the Kodesh, it's now makes the blood invalid. And therefore, it's all going to be not kosher. And this is based on the pasuk that says the following: "The kol chatas asher yuva midama el oel moed lechaper bakodesh lo teachel." That any blood that you bring into the kodesh is going to not be eaten. This is Vayikra Perak Vav Pasuk Gimel. And so as a result, whatever, and because it says Vikol, the Rashi explains, citing the Gemara that we'll see on Daf Pei Bet Amud Aleph, that Vikol shows that it's not only the sin offering is true, but it's true for every offering. It's true not only for Kodshi Kodshim, but even Kodshi Kalim. If you bring any blood into the Kodesh that's not supposed to go there, it's going to invalidate the sacrifice. That's the position of Rabbi Akiva. The Chachamim omrim chatas bilvad. And the Chachamim say it's only the chatas, not true for anything else. Meaning that the pasuk v'kol chatas is specific about the chatas, right? He doesn't use the drasha of vikol the way Rabbi Akiva does. And Rabbi Eliezer Omer, our Rabbi Eliezer, who says, and same with an asham in our Mishnah, also over there says, af ha'asham, also an asham, shene'amar, kachatas kasham. Just like our lesson that we learned over here. He says, just because it says those two together, then we've got it. Well, Bishlam and Rabbi Eliezer, we can understand Rabbi Eliezer's view. He just explained it. The chatas kasham, we need to say that the asham's like the chatas. El Rabbanan, my taima. Why don't the rabbis agree with Rabbi Eliezer? Meaning, Rashi, as Rashi says, Havada itkush asham lechatas. Last Rashi on the daf of Yudam and Bet. They certainly agree that there's a connection that's being made in the pasuk Perak Zayin in Vayikra of Kakatas Kasham. So answer number one, Amarava Av Nichnas Damo Lifnim Pasol Lo Matis Amra Kalvachomer Ma'al Miola. That you can't say that when it comes to an asham, that the blood comes in, it's going to be invalid, because the rabbis would make a kal v'chomer from an ola. That when it comes to, as we turn to Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, Ma'ola, Shehi Kalil, Nichnas Dama Lifnim, Kshera, that when an Ola gets completely consumed, and yet when you bring its blood into the Kodesh, again, according to the Chachamim's point of view, who disagree with Rebbe Akiva, if you bring it into the Kodesh, it does not make it puzzled. It remains kosher to sprinkle, and therefore the korban still remains kosher. Nichnas dam asham she'enu kalil lo kol shekain. Well, an asham that does not get consumed certainly should end up being kosher, even if its blood gets brought in. But one second, we know exactly what the Gemara is going to respond. One second, Mala Ola Shekain Eina Mechaperes. You can't learn from an Ola to an Asham. An Asham atones, an Ola does not. So, Minchas Chote Tochiach. The mincha of a sin offering, namely the mincha of a sinner, namely the korban ola v'yored of the very poorest person, that will contradict us. So how do I know? So first, so now the Gemara interrupts and says, why are you citing the why are you citing the mincha offering? Why not cite the bird sin offering and say that that is the one that if you bring the blood in, and then it'll stay kosher? Well, chatas ha'of baya de Rabbi Avinu he. That the question of whether blood of a bird sin offering that goes into the Beis Hamikdash is the question that Rabbi Avin asked. Meaning, take a look at Rashi, third line down in the Rashi on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Chatas ha'of by the Rabbi Avin he. Hecha dehichnis, in a situation where it gets brought in. Dama lifnim b'tzavara. It gets the blood of the bird offering is not put into a kli, but rather it is sprinkled directly from the neck of the bird. She'ein l'dama kabbalah. There is no receiving of the blood in a vessel for a bird. Umi boile beperek dam chatas. And we ask the question on Daf Tzadik Bet Amud Bet, im nifsula bekach olo velo ifshitale law, and we don't answer that question. So because we don't know for sure whether the chatas ha'of, if the blood comes into the kodesh, it will be considered still a kosher sin offering or not. So that's why we bring the example of the meal offering, of the mincha offering, that if you bring the mincha offering in, it still is going to remain kosher. V'lifroch mala minchas chote shekain eina min zebach. But you could object to the mincha offering because it's not a slaughtered animal at all. So ola tochiach. So then we'll use the ola. The ola, remember, is slaughtered. That's a big animal. Chazar adin. And so again, we can use the combination of ola and the mincha sin offering. So lo re'izeh k'reizev, lo re'izeh k'reizeh. Each one has unique characteristics. Hatzara shavasha behen shehem kodshe kodshim. They're both kodshe kodshim. Nichnas lefdim ksherim. You bring them in to the kodesh, and yet they still stay kosher. Afani avi asham. So too we can learn from them to the asham. Shu kodesh kodeshim v'nichnas damo lefnim kosher. So you should be able to bring them in, and it's all kosher. But one second, Amar le Rabba Mibarnish le Rav Ashi v'lifroch malat tzara shavash behen shekain ein lehen kitzva tomer ba'asham sheyesh lo kitzva. Just the same question we saw 5 minutes ago with respect to the last drasha. That one second you can't learn from an ola and the mincha and the chatas mincha chatas minchas chote, because those two korbanot. Those two offerings don't have a minimum price, but the asham has a minimum price of 2 shkalim. So as a result, we reject all of the things that we've just said. Elahainu taima d'Rabbanan. Here's the reason that the rabbis say that we are not going to use kachatas ka'asham to tell us that if you bring the blood of the asham in, that it's going to be puzzle, and they limit it to chatas. So the Amar Kra, Dama because the Torah says, Vayikra Perek Vav Pasuk Kav Gimel, V'kol chatas asher yuva midama el ohel moed l'chaper b'kodesh lo teachel. That only its blood, only the chatas's blood, dama shel zu, below dama shel acher. And so as a result, we're going to use this drasha to basically override the connection of kachatas kasham. Yes, there's some kind of similarity between an asham and the chatas, as we will see in a few moments. But we're not going to use that to say that the blood of the asham, if you bring it in, is going to be puzzle. But rather, the blood only of the chatas is, if you bring it into the kodesh, will the carbon be puzzle. V'idach, well, 1 second, what does Rabbi Eliezer do with this word dama? Dama below v'sara. No, the point of dama is to tell you that it means blood and not bringing in the meat. Meaning, if you were to bring the meat of the chatas into the kodesh, that would not undermine the nature of that sacrifice. V'idach dam dama. And well, what about the rabbis? How do they learn this concept that only blood disqualifies and not bringing in meat? No, they learn it also from that same word, but they note that the Torah could have just said dam. But the fact it said dama, we're going to learn two things. We're going to learn both that it's only the chatas, and it's only the chatas' blood and not the chatas' meat. Well, 1 second, v'idach, what about Rabbi Eliezer? Why doesn't he learn both dam and dama to teach two things? Dam dama lo darish. He does not think that the fact that it says dama instead of dam, that's a difference that is worth learning from. Okay. So Bishlama Rabbanan. So now we go in the other direction. Right now, we just spent the last 10 minutes asking on the rabbis how come they don't use kachatas kasham. But now we're going to point out that the rabbis have an advantage over Rabbi Eliezer. To Amar Asham Shishachato Shalo Lishmo Kasher. That the rabbis say that, of course, if you slaughter an Asham and you don't have in mind the right carbon, it's still going to be kosher. Because again, like every sacrifice other than the chatas and the Pesach. Hainu to itkash minchas lechatas mincha laasham. Well, we have two different connections of the mincha offering. That one says the mincha is like a chatas, and one says that the mincha is like an asham. So now it totally makes sense because an asham, as we'll see in just a moment, Titania. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Kodesh Kodeshim, he kachatas v'chasham. That when it says, this verse is about a mincha, and the mincha is now being compared to both a chatas and an asham. Minchas chote harehi kachatas. If you have a mincha of a sinner, namely the korban olav yored for the very poorest of people, lefikach, when it comes to that, lefikach matzah shelo lishma psula. If you have in mind when you do the kamitza, which is the grabbing with the 3 fingers, and then the wiping off of anything extra that's grabbed of the korban mincha of the flour, then it's going to be, if you have in mind the wrong korban, it's going to be invalid. If you have in mind that you're bringing it not as a chatas, but as an asham or anything else, it's going to be invalid. Just like when you have with respect to the regular chatas, that if you have in mind the wrong thing, it's going to be invalid. And minchas nedava harehi ka'asham. But a mincha that is just a voluntary offering, that will be like an asham, meaning that if you have in mind the wrong korban, it remains valid. So lefikach kamatza shelo lishma kshera. If you do the kamitza for something else and have in mind a different korban, it works. But El Rabbi Eliezer. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that both the chatas and the asham are both puzzle if you have in mind the wrong korban, how is it that we can make the mincha offering both like a chatas and separately like an asham? L'mai hilchasa ikash mincha lechatas umincha lasham. Why does the Torah connect the mincha both to a chatas and to an asham? So l'chi idach the Rabbi Shimon. No, so he'll say it's for the other position of Rabbi Shimon. That what does Rabbi Shimon say? D'tanan. So the Tanakama says shalo b'chli shares psula. If you after you do the kamitza and you grab that amount of flour mixed with oil, and you wipe off the extra using your pinky and your thumb. This is what the Kohen does, of course. Then you put it. You need to put it in a special vessel, and then you bring it to the to the altar, and then it's going to get burned on the altar. So that is the service. The kamitza is Rashi tells us is comparable to the slaughtering. The putting it in the vessel is comparable to the receiving of the blood. The bringing it to the altar is comparable to the bringing it to the altar, and the burning of it is comparable to the burning of the to the sprinkling to the throwing of the blood to the throwing of the blood. So we see that this sacrifice compares in all four cases. And so the Tanakama says, well, look, if you don't put it back in the right vessel, you haven't done the Kabbalah for a blood sacrifice. So it's as if as it's going to be puzzle. Rabbi Shimon Machshir, but Rabbi Shimon says, no, it's still kosher. Amar Rav Yehuda braid the Rabbi Chia, and Rabbi Yehuda said, the son of Rabbi Chia said, my time of the Rabbi Shimon. What's Rabbi Shimon's logic? Why does he say that it's still kosher? Amar Kra, Kodesh Kodashim Hi Kachatas Kasham. That's the verse that compares the chatas to a to both. That compares the mincha to both the chatas and the asham. So bala ovda biyad. If you, meaning that you can use that service, doing the service like an chatas and like an asham. How? Bala ovda biyad. If you want to use your hands instead of an actual vessel, ovda biyamin kechatas. Well, then you use your right hand, just like you use your right hand to put the blood on the altar. Specifically, you use a finger to put the blood on the altar. Bichli, but if you want, you could use a vessel and ovda bismo kasham, and then you could use your left hand or any hand. It doesn't make a difference, because when you bring the vessel with the blood of the asham, you can use even with your left hand to put the blood, to throw the blood on the altar. So the Rabbi Shimon, Haikra, Mapik Leilahachi, Umapik Leilahachi. Well, 1 second. Now we have Rabbi Shimon using this same pasuk for two different things. He's learning both the fact that the mincha offering is done either by hand or by vessel, and he's learning, according to Rabbi Eliezer, and he's learning the fact that the asham is also going to be puzzle if you have in mind the wrong sacrifice. So no, yeah, you're right. He is learning two things, but Ikar Kral the Rabbi Yehuda braid the Rabbi Chia Huda Asa. The main lesson is about bringing the mincha offering either in a vessel or not in a vessel. Uminchas chote tipsula shalol shma. But when it comes to the sin, the mincha offering of a sin offering being invalid if it's not for the right reason, if you bring it for the wrong korban, taima achrinahu. That actually is based on something else. Chatas taimamai. Why is it that we say with respect to the sin offering that you gotta bring the right, you have in mind the right sin offering? Diksiv ba who? It's the Torah specifically says who. Now the Gemara here uses the word he, but the actual pasuk says who. So that's why I'm reading it who. Minchas chote namiksiv ba he. So too with respect to the mincha offering, it has the same word, hey vav aleph, although there we pronounce it he, because in the Torah, every time we have the word he, it actually is hey vav aleph. But the bottom line is that that's going to be, we learn the fact that you have to have in mind the right offering from the same word that we use with respect to the chata. So we don't use kachatas kasham for that lesson. Rather, we use the word who. And so as a result, we can now learn both things. And as for the asham being like the chatas, that is from the phrase kachatas kasham in a different pasuk, not the pasuk that is talking about, not the pasuk that is talking about a mincha offering. Okay. So, Ula Rabbanan, Lamai hilchasa itkash asham lechatas. Why? So we got to go back now all the way to the beginning. And again, the rabbis, we don't know why what they do with the connection of asham and chatas. So lomar lecha. So they'll tell you that. What is it telling you? Ma chatas te'una smicha af asham ta'un smicha. That just as a sin offering requires the leaning on it before it's slaughtered, so too an asham requires the leaning on it. Okay, back to our Mishnah. So after we had the position of Rabbi Eliezer, we had the position of Yosef ben Choni. And Yosef ben Choni said that when it comes to something that was slaughtered for the sake of a Pesach during that if you slaughtered some other korban and you had in mind the Pesach on Pesach, or you slaughtered some other korban and you had in mind a sin offering at any other time of year, then that also would be invalid. So again, remember the Tanakama says it's only the other direction. That if you bring a Pesach for Pesach, and you then have in mind some other korban, then the Pesach's not going to be valid. And when you have a chatas, whenever during the year you bring it and you have in mind another korban, it's also not going to be valid. But the Tanakama would say if you have in mind the other direction, it's going to be fine, whatever you were to bring. It won't count for your actual sacrifice, but you'll still be okay. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Yosef ben Choni, Rabbi Eliezer, Amru Davar Echad. Actually, Rabbi Eliezer and Yosef ben Choni say the same thing. Rabba Amar, no, ba'acherim l'shem chatas pligi. No, they disagree about the sin offering. That according to Yosef ben Choni, not only if you have in mind the Pesach, do you say that we're going to say that it's that korban Pesach on Erev Pesach, is it going to be that other korban, whatever you were originally intending it to bring, it's going to be puzzle. But also if you bring any korban during the rest of the year and have in mind a sin offering, so that will be puzzle as well. But Rabbi Eliezer would only go in the other direction with respect to the Pesach offering. He wouldn't go in the other direction with respect to a sin offering. So how do I know both of these positions? Meaning, how does Rabbi Yochanan derive his position and how does Rabbah derive his position? Tanya, we have a brisa. HaPesach she'avra shnaso, if you have a Pesach who's older than a year. And Rashi tells us, if it's older than a year, well, then it's treated like a shlamim. Ushchato bismano lishmo. And now you shech this animal that is older than a year, so it can't be a Pesach offer. So we treat it like a shlamim. And you have in mind a Pesach, and you have in mind the korban Pesach, v'chein hashochet acherim l'shem Pesach bismano, or if you slaughter anything else on Pesach for a Pesach, Rabbi Eliezer posel. Rabbi Eliezer says it's puzzle. So clearly, Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Choni, Yosef ben Choni, that at least when it comes to the Pesach, if you slaughtered in the wrong direction, it's going to be invalid. Rabbi Yoshua, Masha, and Rabbi Yoshua, like our Tanakama, would say, no, that's totally fine. And now we're going to have the conversation between Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yoshua, im b'shar yemos hashana, every other day of the year, she'eno kasher lishmo, if you offer a Pesach and you have in mind Pesach, acherim ksherim lishmo, I'm sorry, the Pesach is not going to be valid if you offer it as a Pesach any other time of the year. But acherim ksherim lishmo, but if you were to offer any other sacrifice as a Pesach, it would be kosher. Meaning, again, if you offer an Ola in September as a Pesach, it's considered an Ola. And it won't fulfill your obligation if you promise to give an Ola, but it still counts as a good sacrifice. And so, bismano shehu kasher lishmo. Well, then, when you bring a korban Pesach on Pesach, when it's, of course, kosher to bring it and have in mind the korban Pesach, Eino din acherim lishmo. Well, listen, if you brought an Ola in September and you said it was a Pesach, the Ola is kosher. Now that when the Pesach is going to be kosher, if you're going to bring it on Erev Pesach, the Ola should certainly be kosher if you have in mind a Pesach. So Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, no. Oh, Chilav you could just flip it with that kind of logic. You come up with crazy things. Uma im bishar yemos hashana during the rest of the year she'enu kasher lishmo. When you bring up korban pesach, if you bring it as a pesach, it's not going to be kosher. Kosher hu l'shem acherim, and yet if you bring that same korban pesach and you have in mind some other sacrifice, it's going to be good. Bismanu shehu kosher lishmo eino din sheyukshar l'shem acherim. Well, now that you bring the korban pesach on erev pesach and you have in mind the right sacrifice, it's kosher. Well, then certainly when you bring a korban pesach on Erev Pesach and have in mind the wrong korban, it should also be kosher. Because after all, you had in mind the wrong korban any other time of the year, it would be kosher. So, but that we don't, of course, we don't say that. But Yukshar Pesach, but our Barba Asar Shalolishmo. But do we allow a korban Pesach to be brought and on Erev Pesach and say that it's not? And when you have in mind a different korban and say that it's kosher, but Kakat Omer, and yet that's what you seem to be saying. So why doesn't this all work? No, the point is that the reason that when you have in mind something else, it's because it's going to be good as that something else. Meaning, if you have in mind a korban pesach, when you're bringing an ola at some other time, so it's good as an ola. And so too, if you bring the at a time that the shekain hu pasol l'shem acherim. So does that mean that when you now bring, does that tell us anything about now bringing it at a time when the korban pesach needs to have in mind the korban pesach? It doesn't tell you. Meaning, an offering is valid when slaughtering for the sake of a pesach during the rest of the year, because a pesach would be valid there then if it was slaughtered for the sake of that other type of offering, because that would be work. It would be end up being a shlamim. But on Yudalid of Nisan, when the pesach is invalid if it's slaughtered for another purpose, so then other offerings can also be invalid if they're slaughtered for the sake of a pesach. So all of this is the basis. What we've just said is the basis of Rabbi Yochanan. That Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Eliezer would say that the same thing applies for a sin offering. That just like that if you offer something for the sin offering, so then the sin offering is always invalid when slaughtered for the sake of another type of offering. And so as a result, that they will say that any other offering that's offered for a sin offering would also be invalid. That's the logic that serves as the basis of Rabbi Yochanan. But the argument continues. So, because Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua responds to Rabbi Eliezer's argument and says, Im kain horata koach pesach. You have weakened the nature of a pesach, v'nasata koach b'shlamim, and you've given strength to the shlamim, because essentially a shlamim ends up being more strict in your view than a korban pesach, because the shlamim offered as a pesach is not going to be valid during the on Erev Pesach, and every other time of the year, the Pesach that's offered as a shlamim is going to be valid. So you end up making everything. You're making the shlamim stronger than a Pesach. So that doesn't work, because we know that the Pesach is supposed to be stronger, right? And in fact, the source of the Pesach being stronger is in the Torah itself, because va'amartam zevach Pesach hu. We said that the hu teaches that the Pesach is going to be invalidated if offered shalol lishma. But a shlamim stays kosher if it's offered shalol lishma. And now you're making the Pesach weaker and the korban shlamim stronger. So chazer Rabbi Eliezer v'danu din acher. So Rabbi Eliezer says, all right, I can't use that effort to prove it to you. I'm going to try again. Matzinu moser pesach b'shlamim. If you have an extra pesach that's hanging around, how does that happen? Well, you set aside one korban pesach and it ran away, and then you set aside a second one, and now the first one came back. Well, the one that ran away is effectively comes as a shlamim. Ve'ein moser shlomim ba Pesach. But you can't use, if you set aside, if the same thing happened with shlomim, and now you have two shlomim, you can't say, oh, now I want this extra shlomim to be a Pesach. That doesn't work. Uma Pesach shemosaro ba shlamim shchato bizmanu l'shum shlamim pasol shlamim she'ein mosarim ba Pesach ein shchatam l'shem Pesach bizmanu einu din shiu psulin. Well, listen, if in fact when it comes to the korban shlamim that it's if you offer it during the time for pay, if you have a Pesach, which if you have extra can turn into a shlamim, and yet when you bring it on time and you have in mind a shlamim, it's not going to be kosher because that's the time for Pesach. Well, then shlamim, when you don't have, when it doesn't turn into a Pesach, and you think about a Pesach. So again, a korban Pesach can easily turn into a shlamim, and yet if you have in mind a shlamim on Erev Pesach, it doesn't work. A shlamim that can never turn into a Pesach, if you have in mind on Erev Pesach a Pesach bismano eino din shiu psulin, it should definitely not be kosher because it can never turn into a korban Pesach. So as we turn to Yud Aleph Amud Bet, the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yoshua responds, no, Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, Matzinu Moser Chatas Ba'ola. Well, 1 second. Again, if you try to use that logic, you'll come up with things that don't make sense. Because when you have an extra sin offering, again, same situation, you lost one of the animals and you got set aside a second one. Ba'ola. What happens? You let it graze and it gets a mum, and then you sell it and you use the money to bring in ola on the altar. So the ein moser ola bachatas, but you can't use an extra ola to turn it into a sin offering. So umachata shemosra ba ola shchata l'shem ola psula. So if you have a sin offering that you slaughter with the intention of an ola, we already know that that's invalid. And of course, it could potentially become an ola, but an ola could never become a sin offering. Ola she'emo saro balachatas shchata l'shem chatas eno din shetei psula. Same logic. You could say that therefore an ola that you slaughter for a sin offering should always be not kosher. Now, the fact that Rabbi Eliezer doesn't turn around and say, yes, that's exactly right. You're exactly right. If you bring it as a sin offering, so then if you intend an ola as a sin offering, it's not kosher. Well, from the fact that Rabbi Eliezer didn't just quickly respond, you got it, buddy. That shows why Rabbah says that no, Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with respect to a chatas. And Rabbi Eliezer says if you bring in an ola as a chatas, it doesn't make it not kosher. So in any event, Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer responds back, lo, im amart bechatas, you say, you're talking about a chatas, but shekain ksher lishma kol shana kula. But that's because a sin offering is kosher for it when you have it in mind, the right thing in mind, all year. Tomar bepesach she'enu kasher lishmo ela bizmano. But when it comes to a korban Pesach, it's only kosher when you have the right korban in mind in its time. Ho'avahu pasol lishmo. But sometimes, even when you have it in mind, it's going to be invalid. Dinhu sheyapaslu acherim lishmo. It doesn't. So certainly, when you have something that has a korban Pesach in mind, it should also be invalid. Meaning, a korban Pesach is more strict on this level than a korban chatas. And so Rabbi Eliezer is responding that because a sin offering is more strict because a Pesach is more strict than a sin offering, because it's not kosher all year round if you have in mind the korban Pesach. So as a result, you can't use the same logic that I just gave you with respect to a Pesach and apply it to a sin offering. So that concludes our discussion of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yosef ben Choni as to whether or not we don't actually resolve this debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbah, but let's just get at least to the Mishnah. So Shimon Achi Azariah.
Well, you're saying that Rabbi, in the case of an ola, that a chatat could not become an ola, or could become an ola.
A chatas can become an ola. An
Ola.
ola can never
Yeah,
become a chatas.
but it seemed like Rabbi Eliezer at one point said that if you had an ola, it could become a chatat, right? Wasn't he
No.
saying he objected to that? He didn't object. He didn't say anything right away, right?
What he didn't say in support of Rabbah's position. Rabbah says that if you that according to Rabbi Eliezer, if you have an ola and you think and when you're slaughtering it, you have in mind chatas, the ola stays as a valid korban. And that's because he didn't respond to Rabbi Yoshua, who gave an argument as to why if you bring an ola and have in mind as a sin offering, it should be invalid. And he didn't say, yes, you're right. Because he didn't say that shows that that it must be that Rabbi Eliezer doesn't think that if you bring an ola as a sin offering, it's invalid.
Yeah, so I just have to say I've been following this now for days, and I don't understand. So they've mentioned this, but haven't really addressed it. An ola has to be male, at least an individual ola, and a chatat has to be female. And I can't
Correct.
see.
Remember, it's very important that you're just having in mind the wrong korban. Of course, the sacrifice itself is kosher for the original purpose that you brought it. So you're absolutely right. The animal couldn't, in fact, be an ola because
Right.
because it's a chatas, but or it could in fact be a chatas because it's an ola. But the point is that you had in mind the wrong sacrifice. So that we again with other than according to the Tanakama, other than a chatas and a pesach on erev pesach, though if you have in mind the wrong sacrifice, it's okay. It's still going to be kosher. You finish the process. We're going to bring that sacrifice.
But it doesn't
It's
become
the
a
original. It's the original.
It's the original sacrifice. It doesn't change into the thing that you had in mind. It goes back to what you originally brought.
With the exception of the korban pesach brought as shlama, not on erev pesach.
Yes, that exactly because that's
Yeah.
exactly correct.
Yeah.
So it remains an ola.
No, shalol lishma. Except for a korban pesach brought shalol lishma. If you bring a korban pesach as a pesach in September, it's going to be pasul. But if you bring it as something else, then it's going to be a shlomit.
But
So
it
if he
might
has-
be able to be brought as a korban pesach on Pesach Sheni,
Yes, it could be brought as a korban pesach
as long as it hasn't gotten too old.
as long as it hasn't gotten too old. Correct. Okay, we got to finish up to the Mishnah. So Shimon Achi Azariah Omer. So we saw in our Mishnah that Shimon, the brother of Azariah, said that basically the question is do you go up in sanctity? If you try and go up in sanctity, everything is kosher. But if you go down in sanctity, it doesn't work. Rav Ashi Masnei Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Ashi taught in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Acha braid the Rava Masni Mishmei the Rabbi Yanai, and Rav Acha taught in the name of Rabbi Yanai. My time at Shimon ben Shimon Achi Azariah. What's the reasons for Shimon? The Amar Kara lo yechalalu es kodshe bnei Yisrael es asher yarimu laHashem. That it doesn't become profane. That the literal translation of this is that they shouldn't profane the hallowed things of the children of Israel, that which will separate for Hashem. But the implication is that if you do something that is yarimu b'muramehen ein mischalin, if you raise up the sanctification, that is not going to cause it to become profane. But if you lower the sanctity, well, then you're going to be profane. But second, can you use that pasuk to teach this? We need it for Shmuel's teaching. To Amr Shmuel, how do I know that eating tevel, a mixture of grain, the original mixture of grains before you take trumas and maisros, so that you're subject to the death penalty at the hands of Hashem? So Shenemar v'lo yichalalu es kodshe b'nei Yisrael es asher yarimu laHashem. It's the same pasuk. Ba'asidim litrom hakasav medaber. That the pasuk is referring to things that are going to be holy, that you're going to take away. Meaning the truma is going to be taken away, but it hasn't yet been taken away. Yarimu and truma share the same root. So im kain lichtov akra asher hurmu. My asher yarimu shmamine tarti. No, actually, we can learn two things because the Torah could have said hurmu. The fact that it said yarimu teaches us that we can use that same verb for two purposes. So by Rabbi Zeruk sherim ve'ein meratzin. Well, maybe we're going to say that according to Rabbi Zera, when it says that it's kosher, if you go up in sanctity, it means kosher, but it's not going to satisfy your obligation with respect to the whatever you needed to do. Meaning that if you obligated yourself to bring that korban, you're going to need to bring a replacement. And the fact that they're really arguing about one specific case. That when it comes to a sacrifice, slaughter for the sake of an offering with a lower level of sanctity, that's where Shimon is arguing. O Dilma, ksherim meratzim. Or maybe not only is it kosher, but it's even acceptable, and therefore betarti pligi. And therefore, when it comes to things that go up in sanctity, not only is Shimon saying it's kosher, but it's kosher and it fulfills your obligation. And again, remember, the obligation is for the original korban that you had in mind, not the korban that was had in mind when the slaughtering was happening. Amar Abaye v'itema Rav Zereka Tashma. Come and I'll try and show you which answer it is, which approach it is. Habachor ba'maser shchatan l'shem shlamim ksherim. If you slaughter a meiser or a bechor for a shlamim, it's going to be kosher. Shlamim l'shchatan l'shem bechor or l'shem meiser psulin. But if you slaughter in the other direction, it's going to be puzzle. Now that is definitely consistent with Shimon ben the Achi Azariah, because we're not talking about chatas, we're not talking about asham, we're talking about kachim kalim, and yet if you go down in sanctity, because a bechor and meiser are less holy than a shlamim, you end up having an invalid korban. Now, if you think that it really means kosher and it fulfills your obligation, bechor bar b'ritzuyehu, is there any way that you can make a vow to offer a bechor? No, you can't do that. A bechor becomes a bechor because it was the firstborn animal. It must be that it's kosher and doesn't have any acceptance. And so as a result, since this example is a case of where it's valid but does not provide acceptance, Reisha Nami, when we say, talking about going up in value, in sanctity, it's kosher, we mean ksherim ve'ein meratzin, it also is kosher and without being accepted. Midi area, 1 second, that's not a proof. Hagadisa, maybe it just means it's kosher for whatever you need it to be. Elamai kamash malan. How am I going to learn it from the following? Gavoa v'namuk kamash malan. The fact that it's greater and lesser. So I'm sorry. Why is he teaching it at all? Then he's teaching us that there's a greater and lesser with respect to Tanina. We already know that there are greater and lesser holinesses. Ketzad kachim shchatan shlashem kachim kalim. That's because we say that there's kachim and kachim kalim. So we know that there are multiple levels. So why did Shimon bother to give us the example of bechor and meiser brought as a shlum? So ma'odetema, what would I have thought? Kachim, the kachim kalim. I might have thought that there are only two categories, kachim kalim and kachim. And the kachim is obviously the more holy, and the kachim kalim is the less holy. But maybe within each category, we wouldn't define about kalim, but kalim low, but maybe we wouldn't define within the two kinds of kalim. And so that's why he taught it. So hanami tanina. But 1 second, even that we taught. Shlamim kod munezach bechor. That we're going to see in a Mishnah on Daf Pei Ted Amud Aleph, that the Shlamim comes before the Bechor, meaning that it's holier than the Bechor. B'mneisha hein te'unim matan arba, because they have 4 blood applications on the 4 walls of the Mizbeach. Usmicha nesachim, and they have both a smicha and the libations. Utanuvas chazev v'shok, and you have the waving of the breast and the thigh for the Kohanim. So as a result, we don't need to teach that. No, ha'ikar hahi agrara naspa. No, that was the primary source. This was the secondary source, and so as a result, that's the bottom line. So as a result, we have not answered the question that Rabbi Zera asked, whether we say when Shimon Achi Azariah says that it's kosher if you go up in sanctity, does he mean kosher and miratzah, or does he mean only kosher ve'ena miratzah? So that is a question that does not get resolved, and I don't think we wouldn't paskin like Rabbi Zera, we wouldn't paskin like Shimon, the brother of Azariah. So at least I don't think so, and so as a result, it's not actually directly relevant. But the bottom line is that question is left unresolved, and so we'll
So
pick up, God
a
willing,
couple
next time with
questions
the
on
Mishnah.
this.
Please.
So let's say I have a bunch of animals. I actually start. I have a bakor, and I point to it and say, "Zo shlamim." Have I done anything?
I don't think so, because the Bechor is already holy. And so
Right.
as a
So
result, it's holy from birth, and therefore there's no act that needs to be done, and you can't do anything to undo the Bechor nature of it.
second question: does the bakor go through the procedure for the Meister Behema?
That's a great question. I have not ever explicitly learned that the answer is no, but it's got to be that the answer is no.
Because it can't be both the
Correct.
bakor
Correct,
and
exactly.
so
So
the next
that's why I think it's got to be that the answer is no. But I don't remember ever explicitly seeing that. God willing, but now that we're in now that we're in Kutchim, so I hope that we'll have an opportunity
I
to
don't
see
remember
that.
ever seeing this. So the
But
next
I don't
question
remember
is:
ever seeing that explicitly. But it's
let's
got to
say
be
I
the no.
appointed a 9-day-old animal before they've done the Meister Behema procedure, and you say Zo Shlamim. Does that animal go through the Meister Behema procedure? I've
That's a
never
good.
seen that either.
I have not seen that, but again, the answer has to be that it can't, because
It's
um,
already a Shlamim,
it's
and we
it's already a shlumim, and so and you already have an obligation to bring it, and it can't turn into a miser behema. So because that we have a Malin ve'emo reading. So I'm pretty sure the answer's got to be that you don't put it through. But again, it's a great question, because I don't remember ever seeing it explicitly dealt with.
and we just identified another way in which the Chata differs from other Kachim Kashim, in that it actually requires 4 real sprinklings, whereas all the other Kachim Kashim are 2 that are like 4.
Yes,
We
that
get
is
that in
true.
chapter 5.
We did see that in connection with well, aren't we yeah we did see that referenced when yesterday or the day before, when we noted the fact that there were other arguments that could have been made by Rabbi Yoshua against Rabbi Eliezer, and to say that the Chatas is unique. And we just say that, well, he only mentioned one, but there are a
Yeah.
variety of other things that could have been mentioned.
Yeah. All right, Yasher Koach.
Yishakov, thank you very
Shana
much.
Tova.
Looking forward, Shana Tova, looking forward to continuing our learning together. God willing, hopefully tomorrow I'll be back to having notes. Have a great day.